Hi guys, this will be our last video for chapter 14, so we are done learning about the history of pretty much everything. History of the universe with the sun, the earth, all the planets, and now we're going to get to actually the living things. I know last time we talked about coacervates and microspheres and all that stuff, and the DNA and the RNA coming together and pretty much making up the first cells, but we didn't talk about what these first cells were. We talked about some of the gases that were on early Earth, which was like ammonia, methane, water vapor, hydrogen. But there's two main things we've talked about throughout this year with gases. When we went over photosynthesis, we talked about plants taking in carbon dioxide. And then the plants will take in the carbon dioxide, convert it into a byproduct of oxygen, give that off for us to breathe. Well, there wasn't any oxygen either in early Earth, so we didn't have carbon dioxide, which plants breathe. Okay. We didn't have oxygen, which we breathe and all other animals. So, what were these early life forms? Well, if you go back from literally, I think, the second day of class, we talked about the 8 characteristics of life. And we went over this. We talked about what you guys thought made something living. And a lot of you said, well, it has to breathe. Well, the funny thing is the earliest forms of life didn't actually have to breathe. They didn't take in oxygen or carbon dioxide. So we're going to talk about them today and talk about how it got to be, different organisms that use carbon dioxide, that used oxygen. All right, so just to talk about this first slide, guys. Again, little to no oxygen, also little to no carbon dioxide at first. And we found out that the oldest fossils actually resemble prokaryotes. Now, throughout the year, we talked about prokaryotes. Most of the time, I'm like, okay, let's talk about bacteria. But these are going to be a little bit different prokaryotes today. So we found out that the first organisms or the first cells, and this was made by studying all the fossils, were anaerobic, which anaerobic means that they do not breathe any kind of air. They don't breathe oxygen. They don't breathe carbon dioxide. And they were also heterotrophs. If you guys remember, heterotrophs are organisms that cannot make their own food. So we had heterotrophs and we had autotrophs. Autotrophs were the plants that can make their own food. Heterotrophs cannot. Okay, so since they couldn't make their own food, these first organisms had to compete for food, meaning this was probably our earliest form of natural selection. The ones that got food, they survived. The ones that didn't get food, well, they died. So we're going to talk about two main organisms in the early parts of this section. We're going to talk about archaea and we're going to talk about bacteria. And we had to kind of wonder which one came first, kind of like the chicken and the egg thing. All right. So they did some studies on archaea and they did some studies on bacteria, and this is what they found. They found that the earliest fossils, they think, were really, really closely related to archaea. Now, we still have archaea living today, but they're not quite sure what the archaea was back then. They're not sure if it was the same archaea as today or a little bit different. But if you guys have ever gone to like Yellowstone National Park or ever seen a geyser, you could look it up later on, but geyser, like hot springs and stuff like that, that's where archaea live. They thrive in really, really harsh conditions. They could be in really, really hot conditions and they'd be perfectly fine. So that's archaea. Since the earth was really like, I guess you could almost say toxic back then, 4 billion years ago, they think that the first cells were probably more like archaea because they are able to survive in those harsh conditions. They're also anaerobic archaea, so they don't need to breathe carbon dioxide or oxygen in order to, like respire like we do. They still might use some of these, but they might use them for different things. All right. So archaea, just like bacteria, is actually unicellular. All right. They obtain their energy through chemosynthesis. Now, we talked about the early gases on Earth. We talked about ammonia. We talked about water vapor. We talked about hydrogen gas. We talked about methane. Okay. But if you read here, carbon dioxide serves as the carbon source. Okay. Well, carbon dioxide was not one of the first gases, which means the methane, along with the water vapor, actually got transformed to start making carbon dioxide. And this was a very long time ago. So we started to get more gases in the Earth's atmosphere. So we started to get some carbon dioxide, and that allowed the archaea to actually live. And what the carbon dioxide did was they took in the carbon dioxide, the archaea did, and they transformed this carbon dioxide to make it into other organic compounds, other like carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. So they were able to transform the carbon dioxide to keep them alive. Now again, we just talked about that some of them were able to get more carbon dioxide than others. If they got enough carbon dioxide to make their organic molecules, they lived. If they didn't get enough, well, they died. All right. So that was the earliest forms of life. About 3 billion years ago, so 4 billion years ago, the Earth got created. We started with the archaea, and then the carbon dioxide, the amount started to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, now we started to have new organisms other than just archaea, and these new organisms were ones that were able to actually use the carbon dioxide and transform it, not just into organic compounds, but into making other forms of energy. And you guys know those are our plants, okay? So 3 billion years ago, we started to get plant-like structures. In looking at fossils, they found cyanobacteria. It's pretty much a plant. It goes through photosynthesis, but it's unicellular, unlike our plants. All of our plants we have now, guys, you look outside, the grass, all the lilies out there, all the trees, they're all going to be multicellular, and they're going to be eukaryotic instead of prokaryotic. But they're still going to go through photosynthesis. So cyanobacteria still went through photosynthesis, but it was a prokaryote, didn't have a nucleus, and it was also unicellular. And they found some of these in fossils, but the fossils weren't as old as the archaea. So what happened here was with the cyanobacteria was now able to photosynthesize. So the cyanobacteria took in the carbon dioxide and they transformed it into oxygen. Well, okay, for a while everything was fine. A little bit of oxygen, we didn't have a whole lot of cyanobacteria, so it wasn't a big deal. But as time went on, these cyanobacteria kept photosynthesizing. They kept taking in the carbon dioxide and then expelling oxygen out. So what happened was, at this time, the oxygen levels actually started to go up, 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 up. Well, yeah, that's fine because the cyanobacteria was creating it. It's fine for them. The problem was some of the other organisms were unable to adapt to these increasing oxygen levels. So in not being able to adapt, a lot of them actually became extinct. All right. So we think that it took a very, very, very long time for oxygen levels to reach today's levels, all right, kind of like 1 billion years. But I don't want you guys to think right away that, okay, we got oxygen now, we can start making animals and things like that. No, 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 it took a extremely long time for oxygen levels to reach today's. So if the cyanobacteria started doing this at like 3 billion years ago, it probably took until 2 billion years ago for smaller organisms like, I don't know, like fish and stuff like that, tadpoles, to be able to even survive in our atmosphere, okay? But along with this, guys, along with the cyanobacteria taking in the carbon dioxide, okay, we had Earth, but we didn't actually have a boundary to Earth during this time. 4 billion years ago, we just had Earth and we had some gases floating throughout, and those gases were just kept in from the gravitational pull of the Earth. Well, as the cyanobacteria was taking in the carbon dioxide and expelling the oxygen, some of the oxygen was just chilling there. But then other molecules of oxygen actually went up, 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 up to the outer parts of our atmosphere, of Earth's atmosphere. And what happened was it became our ozone, which is really good, so now we have a nice ozone layer. So that way when us and other animals came into existence, we didn't have to worry about all the ultraviolet rays and all the radiation from the sun. So that was really good for us. Difference between oxygen and ozone. Oxygen is O2, meaning there's two oxygen atoms bonded together. In ozone, it's 1, 2, 3 oxygen atoms bonded together. Okay. So there is your picture of the Earth there, and you guys can see where the ozone layer is. So the oxygen had to go above the troposphere, and that's where it formed our ozone layer. Okay. And again, guys, that blocks all the harmful radiation from the sun. All right, last thing for this chapter. So during this time, we started to get all of our prokaryotes. We had our archaea, we had our archaebacteria, we had our cyanobacteria, and then we started to get these new cells, but they weren't complete yet. They're what resembled eukaryotes, so they started to have a nucleus. Remember prokaryotes, guys? The DNA is not in a nucleus. Eukaryotes, they house their DNA inside of a nucleus. But what happened was these eukaryotes, they were gigantic cells compared to the prokaryotes. They're like 10 to 100 times as big as a prokaryotic cell. And they were so big that they couldn't quite survive on their own, and they couldn't make their energy. So what they did was they found some different organisms that were prokaryotic, and they pretty much had some kind of a meeting. It was a very long, beautiful, elaborate table, and the eukaryotic cell had a nice meeting with the prokaryotic cell, and they were pretty much, it was like a heated debate on, okay, what can I give you and what can you give me? Well, they came up with this solution, and these prokaryotic cells said, all right, for the eukaryotic cell, we'll make you your energy. And then the eukaryotic cell said, in return, prokaryotic cell, you can live inside of me and I will protect you. Because the prokaryotic cells were really, really, really small, and most of them, like we talked about earlier, most of them, became extinct. So the prokaryotic cells got a house. They were able to be fed by the eukaryotic cells, and in turn, the prokaryotic cells made energy for the eukaryotic cells. And we call this the endosymbiotic theory or endosymbiosis. So we think that for us, our mitochondria and our chloroplasts were once prokaryotic cells. How do we know this? Well, the mitochondria and chloroplasts, if you look at them, the structure of them, they actually have two membranes, just like a prokaryotic cell. Now we call them the outer and inner membranes for the mitochondria and the chloroplast, but in reality it would be the cell wall, which is the outer, the cell membrane, which is the inner, and they actually have their own DNA, which is not housed inside of a nucleus. So it's just like a prokaryotic cell without its nucleus. All right, so that's the endosymbiotic theory, guys. It's the theory that we think that our mitochondria, and for plants, the mitochondria and the chloroplasts, were once prokaryotic cells, that our cells, our eukaryotic cells, engulfed, and they had a symbiotic relationship together. All right, so in overall, guys, everything was stable. Usually, if we're putting one thing inside of another, it's not real stable, but this was a very stable environment for the eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. All right, and that's it, guys. Have a good rest of your day.